Good evening, Anglo-futurists. Calum and I are in the King Charles III space station together as usual.
However, we are soon coming down to Earth, and we would like to see you, our listeners, at the pub.
On the 12th of September, we'll be getting listeners together, and if you email us at anglofuturism2074@gmail.com, then we'll be in touch with the venue. We promise flat ale,
Piping hot
buxom beer maids, piping hot what?
Piping hot ale.
Piping hot ale. And we look forward to seeing you there.
Who now has anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country?
Georgian townhouses on the moon.
The highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way.
Small modular reactors under every village green.
This is Anglo-futurism.
Hello and welcome to the King Charles III space station. I'm Tom O.
And I'm Calum Drysdale.
Now, we reopened the KC-3 in the 90s after it had been mothballed as part of a corporate restructuring. And since then, we've had a strict rule about guests. Namely, they only get one invitation.
Not that many have been clamouring to return. After all, we still haven't got the boiler working consistently.
Nevertheless, we now welcome back Rian Chad Whitton. The people clamour for word about bauxite, aggregate, industrial energy, and Vox Populi, Vox Dei. Rian, with a handsome new moustache, welcome back.
Hi, Tom. Hi, Calum. It's a pleasure to be here.
Honestly, the last time I saw a moustache like that this early in the morning, it was after an encounter with Tom Selleck.
Yeah, well, I think we're kind of describing it as a cross between First World War flying ace and strongman dressed in a leotard. So I think, yeah, we really cannot stress how impressive this thing is.
Anyway, Ryan's settling his bulk into the Chesterfield. Should we start off by talking about the 20th century? Not a great century for fans of this podcast, but nevertheless.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to add to that. Sorry, that you know, it is often cast as this narrative, right, of decline. That post Second World War, basically all our manufacturing went to pot, and you know, everyone in the 50s was on Excel, you know, making slides. But that's not really the case, is it?
No. I think, yeah, like we've built up a kind of retrospectively built up a story about British deindustrialization, which kind of like evens out what is actually a very volatile sort of process, like over like the post-war period, right? So, you know, we just sort of assume that sort of manufacturing sort of declines in this country and becomes less competitive globally from 1950, like gradually, like to 2025. This isn't really the case at all. I think also there is a problem whereby even in our, you know, very unique circumstances, both the left and the right kind of want to sort of lay all the blame for our current predicament at the other's door. In the case of the left, they kind of want to lay the blame at Thatcher's door or at Nigel Lawson's door. In the case of the right, they want to go even further back and sort of blame Clement Attlee and the, you know, Town and Country Planning Act and the Distribution of Industry Act and so forth. And besides, I think, being not particularly tactically helpful to building sort of, you know, good coalitions today, because it just sort of brings up old grudges. I think it's also missing quite a lot of the detail. I think it's notable that despite many of its travails, by 1998, 1999, British industry is actually in quite a good place. Actually, it's at least by gross value added, the fourth largest industrial base in the world, right? It's got a functioning steel industry, it's got a functioning chemical industry, it's got functioning heavy industry at large, and it's got functioning light industry at large. There are some problems around sort of the degree of foreign ownership, particularly seen in the automotive sector, but it's diversified, it's deep, it's globally quite competitive, and it looks to be entering the 21st century, with a degree of confidence and with defensible positions in the global market. It's very interesting. There's a good book by Jeffrey Owen, a former sort of Financial Times columnist, talking about, essentially the history of British industry in the 20th century. It's called From Empire to Europe. And he has a final chapter where he sort of mentions all these sort of new exciting British companies that look set to do well in the kind of new information economy and be competitive globally in manufacturing. And he kind of, it's somewhat tragic because all these companies end up going to the wall or getting bought by Americans. But there is this sense of optimism that's quite well founded on our fundamental position. And he's assuming that we're going to be competing against Germany, Japan, the United States, South Korea, and so forth. In this last chapter, looking forward to the 21st century, there's no mention of China at all, and that's sort of the glaring omission. I think when people were thinking about British manufacturing in 2000, they really weren't envisioning that there would be this sort of behemoth that would just soak up all possible industrial production for the next 20 years or so.
That's extraordinary. Is there another country that's going to come out of the blue and just like totally annihilate the predictions of FT columnists?
I mean, I suppose India, right? India has many of of similarly large population. Could it not do the same thing? Like we're quite
it's on the radar.
Blasé.
India's on the radar.
We're quite blasé about India, though.
Yeah, I think you have to hand it to the Chinese, and whether that's at the local level or at the corporate level or at the level of central government, the scale of the growth has been pretty momentous. I've actually been looking at the global battery industry. There's a very good sort of 500 page slide deck from this company called the Volta Foundation. It's really good reading. You'd love it. Absolutely tremendous.
Love it's sort of Brian just tucked up reading this slide deck.
Well, it basically goes through global sort of battery and electric vehicle production, and 90% of it is just talking about China. About 90% of it, from the cathodes to the anodes to the vehicles themselves, right? And I don't think it got there through comparative advantage, right? It has a pretty, obvious mercantile strategy whereby it's going to soak up all global manufacturing production it can. And it does that through a range of things: cheap energy, it does that through subsidies, it does that through very lax land laws, it does it through very strong government support and direction, and it also does it through, frankly, just having tolerance for much lower profit margins, sub 5%, sub 3%, sometimes they'll start.
And Philip Cunliffe made this point as well, that this wasn't just like China doing well, right? It was also aided and abetted by the West, right? Like I remember when I was at school, early sort of 2010s, the narrative was, oh, great, China is going to like do our manufacturing for us, and that's a good thing, right?
Yes, 100%. But I don't think they anticipated that they would take advanced manufacturing. I think there was this sort of belief that, an industrial base can sort of be segmented out between, the high value added stuff and the low value added stuff, and heavy industry can be separated out from light industry. And I think the experience of the last 30 years or so has kind of highlighted that that's probably not the case. But this is something of a digression. The point is that in 2000, there was plenty of reasons to be optimistic about British industry. And people did not anticipate that the next 20 years would be as bad as they have proven to be, right? And I think you can sort of look at the post-war period as one of sort of qualified successes and failures. The period up to 1945 to 1965 initially looks quite promising, right? People talk a lot about Concord, and obviously Concord in revenue and profitability terms was not particularly successful. But it did highlight the dynamism of the British industrial base, right? That it could build this thing with some French cooperation, at relative speed and, at very high levels of technological sophistication. You then have periods of immense challenge because Japan and Germany are becoming much more competitive. You have attempts to counter this through things like rationalization in the 60s. Rationalization is sort of successful in some cases. So General Electric Corporation gets made during this period, and that goes on to be successful for another 30 years or so. While in other cases, British Leyland, you're sort of marrying Leyland Motors, a successful company, with a much less successful company, and this leads to the merged company generally being quite poor in quality. In the 80s, I mean, we could perhaps talk about where sort of Thatcher fits into this, and whether the deindustrialization of the 80s is sort of the reason for where we are now.
Right. Is this a fate that has befallen? I mean, is this like a uniquely bad outcome for an advanced manufacturing economy?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. So, for example, we might look at a company like, Imperial Chemical Industries, like ICI, right? And we sort of look in the sort of 90s, right? The pharmaceutical division gets turned into Zeneca, which then becomes part of AstraZeneca. A lot of the bulk chemical elements get sold off. There's attempts to restructure it as a more high value added company. In the end, this doesn't really work. It then gets acquired by, I think, AkzoNobel in 2008. And then, certain bulk chemical elements of it then get reincorporated into companies like INEOS and so forth. Maybe onto INEOS like later. But ICI is a particularly sort of extreme case of what was going on in the global chemical industry at that time, right? You had these huge conglomerates like DuPont, BASF, Solvay, and LG Chem and so forth. And in the 90s, lots of these companies were trying to divest low value added sort of segments of the chemicals supply chain, or were trying to prioritize more high value added segments, right? And a lot of this is down to increased competition globally, especially because China starts ramping up bulk chemical production. And so there's a lot of divestitures, and there's a lot of chemical companies globally, including DuPont, who are trying to present themselves less as chemical companies and more as technology companies or research intensive companies. And they're trying to move up the value chain and get higher margins. And ICI is part of that. So we weren't an exception to global trends. However, I think if you kind of accept that, there's countries like China which are beginning to put pressure on global industry by creating overproduction in bulk chemicals and driving down margins globally, Britain seems to be much more susceptible to just exiting the market entirely versus sort of what Germany or Japan or South Korean companies did. I think if you...
I was going to say that, a lot of that, right, that's attitude, right, isn't it? That it seems to be that we've just said, right, yeah, doesn't matter. Heavy industry is just not something we're going to do. And as you say, because you blame someone else, you say we've always been on this like downward trajectory. It's treated as like an inevitability, so it's not worth like putting up the defenses. I mean, you in the report you did for the Jobs Foundation on like energy intensive industries, I think you make a really good point about how the Netherlands, for example, Netherlands and France and Germany provide like significant subsidy. I think it's 50% subsidy compared to British manufacturers, which is, again, then compare that to Chinese subsidy. These are vast like state interventions that prop up industries and allow them to compete.
Yes, I think you kind of have a case of almost sort of the industrial food chain, right? Like where, China is prepared to accept much lower margins and will twist the arm of European, South Korean, and Japanese producers. And because their goods need to go somewhere, they're going to put pressure on British producers. And it seems that we just have the lowest toleration for this kind of, I suppose one might call it race to the bottom. And as you say, we have an intellectual scene where people are much more willing to say, well, if it's not particularly high margin, and if everyone else is prepared to subsidize our consumption, why do we need it here? Why do we need heavy industry? And I think you see that in Britain, you see that in the United States, you see that in countries like Australia as well. There's just much less resilience when it comes to countering sort of overproduction in other parts of the world. So in the case of ICI, you know, ICI does sort of still exist, at least nominally, through like other companies, and you know, the creation of INEOS really in 1998, and its further expansion via acquisitions, including of ICI assets, sort of showcase that while everyone else was trying to divest, you know, bulk chemicals and petrochemical businesses, you know, you have a live player in Jim Ratcliffe who sees, you know, an opportunity. He uses private debt. There's no going public with INEOS, and he essentially acquires these British and European assets, and it all proves quite successful. You know, for the next 20 years, it becomes a fairly profitable business. And INEOS, actually, if you sort of compare it to sort of any new company that might get made today, you know, it has a bulk, you know, olefin business. It has a sort of finer petrochemicals business, and it has sort of, you know, a kind of, you know, plastics business, right? So it's actually, you know, in a weird way, fairly vertically integrated. It also, you know, does ethane production sort of in the United States and so forth. So while much of the market was kind of saying, well, we need to rationalize, we need to chase higher value markets, you know, Jim Ratcliffe sort of acquired loads of assets and actually created quite a successful company. INEOS is definitely struggling in Britain and Europe now, in part due to energy prices, which, you know, are down to a number of things, but in a large part, they're down to government policy.
All this heavy industry you don't have anymore. Are the kind of economist brain pointy heads correct that we didn't need them, or should we miss them? What's your view?
Yeah, so if we're talking about definitions are sort of like the key here, right? So we'll call them sort of like energy intensive industries, which is often could probably be used as a shorthand for heavy industry, right? You know, these are industries where at least a significant component of production energy costs are around 20% of gross value added for the year, right? You know, so that would include sort of battery manufacturing. It would include plastics manufacturing. It would include glass, cement, ceramics. It would include weirdly sort of, you know, some components of electronics manufacturing. It would certainly include all sort of primary metal production, so copper, aluminium, and of course steel. And these are sort of foundational industries, you know, on which, like, you know, the rest of sort of like global manufacturing sort of sits, right?
Yeah, you
And
can't
these
have
are
any
not-
industry without these materials.
Yes, they're not what you'd sort of call discrete manufacturing, right? They are sort of process manufacturing. You're building sort of like large volumes, you know, in the kind of, you know, millions and millions of tons, right? Like that's sort of what's going on. And the argument might be, well, in the case of steel, British steel use per capita is declining, in part because we don't build anything, right? You know, like our overall manufacturing base is quite small. Hence, you know, steel production and steel demand is, you know, relatively small. We have lots of allies who still have steel industries which are in much better shape than us, and we have a load of scrap steel that we can potentially recycle. I think the problem, you know, with that is that, you know, if you're planning for the next 30 to 50 years, right, like you can't just assume that these allies are going to, you know, essentially provide you with sort of cheap steel, sort of, you know, on demand, right? You know, we're entering sort of a very turbulent world. We don't really know how this US-China Cold War is going to play out. We don't really know where Europe's going to be in 10, 20, 30 years, right? We sort of don't know what the case will be with Russia and Ukraine. We don't know what the case will be on the Mediterranean border. We don't know where these economies are going to be. And besides that, there are actually key aspects of these industries where you do want to have some national control. So people might look at British Steel. It produces, a few million tons of steel sort of every year. Out of that, a tiny proportion, maybe like 10,000 tons a year, is sort of, very high grade, billet iron, right? Like essentially like pellets of sort of very high quality iron, not steel. But this is not something that you can just like churn out of an electric arc furnaces. At the moment, it does require a blast furnace to make, at least economically. And this steel or this grade of iron is used almost exclusively in military applications, right? So it's sort of, it's sort of used in in very advanced military products. And that's a component of the British defence industrial base that we own. And if British Steel goes out of business, then we don't own that anymore. Like that's something that we also have to outsource to the Americans or to Europeans and so forth. Besides that, like these jobs or these industries are sort of seen by many as sort of low value added. But this ignores the fact that while the number of jobs they have might be sort of, not as high as it once was, the actual average salary of these jobs is usually actually pretty high and almost always far higher than the average in the local area where they are located, right? So,
and they're often up in the north, right? They're often like, Teesside, Humberside, Merseyside. These are like, in many ways, like it's the most leveling up kind of thing you could do to have more industry.
Yeah. Or just not to let them go to the wall, right? So I mean, certainly, heavily located in the north, in the Midlands, quite a lot in Wales. There is actually heavy industry like in the south. DS Smith, paper manufacturing in Kent is like, sort of the biggest paper mill in Britain. But yes, it is skewed towards the Midlands and the north. And, if you take one example of sort of chemical manufacturing, the average wage or weekly salary of these jobs is, 3 times that of hospitality, or 3 times that sort of, of basic administrative work. There's a petroleum refinery in Milford Haven owned by Valero. The average sort of salary that you have for people working there is in excess of £100,000. And if these petroleum refineries go because of insufficient sort of petrochemical demand, or because we're importing all our jet fuel or so forth, then what's going to replace that in Milford Haven or in Pembrokeshire? It may be a case that sending the ONS to Newport was actually just too much London-centric thinking, right? Actually, we have to send these civil servants out way further, like sort of, into sort of Pembrokeshire,
Yeah.
Darlington.
Although they can only recognise what they do, right? You send the administrators out to Liverpool to like Middlesbrough, and they see the vast manufacturing facilities, and like, God, those could all be office blocks.
Oh dear, yes. Well, that is a potential problem. So, So if we, I think on the question of how necessary is heavy industry. Well, we can say, well, we can just get rid of this. We can sort of let the rest of the world subsidize our consumption of these goods. Our consumption of steel and wood and cement is sort of vaguely going down anyway. Let's just accept it. No country of our size, which calls itself a great power or at least a middle power, is accepting this, right? I think the idea that you should just sort of tap out is sort of the height of short-termism. And most importantly, right, like the argument being made that, you know, we should just sort of accept this and we should cut our losses and we shouldn't put money into nationalization to save these assets if we need to, or we shouldn't give exemptions to heavy industry on energy costs and things like that. Well, this kind of assumes that there's some higher level productivity job at the end of this that, you know, will sort of make the economy more efficient. What you're instead, I think, more likely to do is just to create more welfare deserts, right? Like, you know, I don't foresee a future where British Steel leaves Scunthorpe and then Scunthorpe sort of, you know, reinvents itself, you know, as sort of a, you know, a hub for unicorns, right? Like,
Becomes
more
a real center of like calligraphy and interpretive dance creative industry.
well, you're more likely to find actual unicorns there, right? Like, I think, yeah, and you know, we might say, well, if we can just get local decision making so that you can get local taxation, you know, in Scunthorpe, this allows for economic specialization, and this allows for locals to make better decisions. But I think fundamentally, if you're accepting gradual degradation of the British industrial base, you're just skewing the economy more to London. I think. I don't think there's like, you know, we can create lots of hypothetical scenarios where that is not the case, but historically, I think that's what's been happening.
But this is to an extent self-inflicted, isn't it? It seems from your writing that one of the main causes of the decline of British industry is the incredible increase in the cost of energy. And I know that Tom Forth, friend of the show and listener, has said that maybe energy isn't that important to the death of British industry. But you know, it's pretty extraordinary how we've chosen not to use fossil fuels. We've chosen not to use nuclear. That leaves us, of course, with some options that have their shortcomings, and the result is that energy is very expensive. And the government's response has been to subsidize, or at least I think this is the plan, to subsidize heavy industry with more taxpayer money rather than making the energy cheaper in the first place. I mean, this just seems like catastrophically bad and maybe the single biggest cause of industrial decline. Is that right?
Yeah. So let's we'll sort of unpack this. So the argument that energy prices are not the be all and end all of industrial decline, or they might only be sort of a peripheral factor. This is sort of, you know, the case made, and you know, I agree with Tom Forth on like a lot of things, particularly sort of his screed against human capital and skills. I you know, and I think there is a valid point to be made here, right? I think another one of your guests, Alexander Fitzgerald, sort of said that at least in the realm of industry here is machine tooling, energy costs are not sort of the main bottleneck. And there is truth to this. Hence why the report I did focuses specifically on energy intensive industries. This is not the entirety of the British manufacturing base, right? British manufacturing base has a turnover of about 650 billion pounds, which means there's 650 billion sort of pounds of money sort of flowing through this ecosystem every year. And then the energy intensive sector is about 18 to 25% of that, right? It's about 170 to 200 billion in revenue, and this is petrochemicals, this is steel, this is ceramics, this is cement, this is paper, wood, plastics, and so forth. So energy costs affect some parts of industry way more than others, right? This is understood, and this is very true. It's also true that just having cheap energy prices is not the only thing that you're going to have to do in order to have a functioning heavy industry. And I would sort of be prepared to admit that. I think that is shown most clearly in the performance of the United States. We often think about the US economy as sort of doing very well, mainly because we're looking from Britain, where sort of, their numbers look sort of fantastic.
When you have to crane your neck that much, it doesn't. It's harder to see the details.
Exactly, but there is a very important story here. From about 2000 the US manufacturing production, as sort of seen at the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, so everyone can go see this. Since 2000, it's basically flat, even declining a bit. Like it never has reached its peak or exceeded the peak that it had sort of prior to the financial crisis. And it's had relatively cheap energy, in that time period, at least since 2014, with the fracking revolution. And its differential price relative to Europe has only gotten better. So, to a certain extent, there is a question of why is US industry been stagnant for 20 years when its energy situation, at least, is in a much better position than Britain and large chunks of Europe? And it's very true that there are other factors at play here, right? There's Chinese overproduction, right? There's asymmetric free trade, where the US has been importing huge amounts of goods and manufactured goods from elsewhere. And you've seen a real increase in the value of the dollar relative to other currencies. These things, which are all tied up with America's fundamental political economy, right, where it just imports a hell of a lot more than it exports. These, play decisive roles in its manufacturing sector being stagnant as well. I think what you can say is that if you have a president, like Trump, perhaps, who massively slaps on tariffs and, tries to restrict exports to the United States, the scenario for America to quickly reindustrialize because it has very cheap energy prices is at least much more plausible than it would be for Britain if we engaged in a similar kind of tariff strategy. There are lots of other variables at play, but I think the US has a sort of much more industry-friendly ecosystem, which has so far not offset the sort of structural issues around the relative strength of the dollar and trade asymmetries with China and the rest of the world and so forth. But at least for heavy industry, energy prices are absolutely existential, right? Like if 20% of your gross value added is related to, energy prices, and for steel, it can be as much as 80%, then, Britain's energy price situation is absolutely it just can't continue. And this is why we've had a case where increasingly the government is having to retroactively sort of put on exemptions for heavy industry in order to try and not make them more competitive globally, really, but just try to sort of stave off the bleeding and just prevent them from being too uncompetitive. So
Tom Forth here might be saying that we've slightly gerrymandered the question by saying, okay, we're not talking about just manufacturing, we're talking about energy intensive manufacturing. So potentially he might criticize us in this respect, but I mean that point you made there.
It's a component of wider manufacturing, but then a lot of manufacturers that sort of aren't necessarily energy intensive, are tied to these energy intensive enterprises, right? So I was talking to, a steel fabricator in Dorset, and they make sort of steel to sort of essentially make, large structures like air hangars and so forth. If British Steel was not sort of de facto nationalised and taken control of by the government earlier this year, then they would have been in a financially distressed position, right? Because they have all these long-term contracts with British Steel. They'd have to sort of renegotiate contracts and get more steel of certain grades in from abroad. It's not it would have much wider ramifications than just one sort of plant in Scunthorpe going out of business.
Well, there's also the point you make in your report about that food and drink companies cut trading by sort of 2 days a week in 2022 due to high power costs, right? We are all users of power, and
yes,
it is not a totally, as you say, separated thing. I suppose the question probably that people want to know is, given that we've now said yes, we can, as you said with America, if you put tariffs on, you rechange the political economy, you change the sort of economic structure of your nation, you can revive manufacturing, or you can make it a priority. If we said, yes, we in Britain want to do this, we want to be a manufacturing country, what are the kind of key steps that we need to take, and what would it look like to start moving back and doing what China has done, right? Like, they've made a conscious decision. Could we do that?
Well, yes. I mean, the prescription is much more complicated than sort of identifying like the problems, right? And I'll be the first to admit that. And the fact is, when China, which has now got so big, is playing such an aggressive game in terms of capturing global production, very few of the options you have if you want to increase manufacturing capacity in Britain are particularly appealing, right? At least in the short term, right? It's very challenging. This is something that sort of like none of the major parties really have an answer to, right? Like no one wants to sort of point out that whatever we do is going to be incredibly challenging. I think, yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe if you could talk more about what are these, what do the both sides say? So the people who say we don't need to worry about manufacturing.
Well, some people are saying plunder the Weddell Sea for oil and gas, right, and scrap net zero targets for a few years.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that there are certainly a lot of things you can do in terms of just scrapping sort of the excesses of net zero. Like, for example, like things like the zero electric vehicle mandate, right? Like, whereby you're actually prioritizing the sale of very cheap Chinese electric vehicles over hybrid electric vehicles that might be at least assembled in Britain, right? Like, that's like a very stupid government intervention into consumer choices, right? Same with sort of the heat pump subsidy, right? Like, Britain doesn't have a particularly large gas boiler market because the gas boiler market isn't that large globally, but it's a relatively successful one in relative terms to other European gas boiler markets, and we have our own manufacturers there, and it's considerably larger than our domestic heat pump industry. Like, this seems like something whereby if you want to incentivize the use of heat pumps, the key thing is getting the price of electricity much lower, right? That's the only thing that sort of like matters. This is why France has much higher heat pump adoption than Germany, by the way, right? Like, if you want to sort of get people to sort of move towards heat pumps, just make electricity much cheaper. Easier said than done. But that's sort of what should come first. These things should follow each other, right? Like, make electricity cheap, and then you can think about wide-scale electrification of the heating sector, right?
Well, and I think it's maybe something that people don't quite appreciate is that government is already putting in a lot of money to try and lower energy prices. I mean, energy support policies in 2023 were £51 billion. Yes, size of the defense budget. There is we're in this position where we're both complaining, oh, they're not doing enough. They already are doing a lot to paper over just how bad the fundamental underlying situation already is.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And these exemptions for heavy industry, so that they don't pay much for the sort of these renewable levies or these net zero related levies, these are in place. The problem, and they're getting expanded. The problem is that energy prices have got so high that their importance is sort of relatively limited, right? And their effect is relatively limited. When you consider that aside from energy prices, you also have essentially a global glut of many of these commodities or a lot of these products, that just creates more and more problems. I think at least one thing you can do is say, we currently have a climate change levy which actually taxes electricity generation from fossil fuel sources, right? So it's actually making the cost of electricity more expensive. Well, in that case, like that's something that you could sort of get rid of. The Treasury wouldn't like it because that's a form of revenue for them. But like literally taxing electricity production, right, to make electricity more expensive when the primary focus of net zero, or at least reducing emissions, is to electrify more things, right? That makes no sense. So there are things you can sort of do on the side. Unfortunately, when it comes to getting electricity prices down, it's not something you can sort of just like do very quickly. And you could argue that like a lot of the problems in our grid costs began actually when British electricity prices were at their most competitive globally around 2003 and 2004, because you have this sort of dash for gas, you have a huge glut in gas generation capacity, and there's no real private incentive to build nuclear power at that stage because it just can't compete on a per kilowatt basis with gas. Tony Blair, of course, was interested in building a nuclear towards the end of his tenure, but that was all a bit too late. And then the 2008 Climate Change Act comes in. We start ramping up these levies for net zero. That period between, I think, 2004 and 2008 was pretty critical, right? In the wrong choices being made or a lack of choices being made, to actually set us up well. And I think the problem is not just the like how cheap it is on a per kilowatt basis, right? The problem is also like how much can this grid infrastructure and how much can we build so that if we greatly expand manufacturing demand, we can actually keep prices fairly low, even as demand is going up really quite a lot. And it's not just factories we're talking about here, because obviously data centers is another area of significant demand. We're seeing in the United States, funny enough, that prices are beginning to go up a lot because fundamentally there's just so many new data centers coming on board. They're beginning to, create shortages in electricity supply. And if it's a problem in the United States, you can bet that it's a much bigger problem in Britain, right?
But in the US, this is leading big tech companies to invest in things like geothermal, like Google has this tie-in with Fervo, the geothermal company, and we know that other companies are trying to kind of stimulate SMRs. To me, naively, it seems that this need for data centers might actually be supportive of lowering energy costs for the rest of us and for industry.
What? Because the demand for data centers just creates the incentive to build out more generation.
And when you build out, you develop this kind of frontier stuff like geothermal and SMRs with spillover effects for everyone.
Yes, as I understand, also the US is the current government has at least signalled a desire to quadruple nuclear generation capacity by 2050 or so. I think that these are promises, right? And there are problems in the nuclear supply chain around delivering that, and certainly around construction costs in the United States. But yes, you're right. Like, this might sort of underplay sort of the importance of AI, but its main function so far has been to sort of create lots of interest in creating new power plants, right? It's like who are the big, winners of the sort of data center boom bin, like Nvidia, TSMC, and to like some extent Mitsubishi, just because they're building so many sort of gas turbines, right, for new power plants to support this sort of build out. And this is obviously an area where Britain is massively falling behind. Like I, got a House of Lords question to ask sort of what was sort of the gigawatt sort of capacity demand required by Britain's data centers, and it was about 1.6 gigawatts, right? You have companies like Meta sort of anticipating that they're going to build, individual sort of campuses that are going to require 5 gigawatts of, power capacity, right? We're sort of being left as essentially a spectator to this data center boom. Now, some might say, well, you can just sort of, rent out the data centers, right? I don't think being really at the cutting edge of AI while being a million miles away from the hardware is really likely to, render us particularly competitive in the next 20 and 30 years or so. I think, when we look at,
well, I was going to add to that as well, and it's even more important here because data centers fit so cleanly into your energy intensive sectors, right? What is like 40 to 60% of operating costs are the power. So, they do follow where power goes. So it's, that's a very clear case where power is so important.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. And one can say this, right? Like energy prices, they most acutely affect the energy intensive industries, but they are a general depressant or stimulant on economic activity, depending on sort of, whether they're cheap or whether they're expensive, right? And so, there's no sort of situation where they don't make things quite a bit easier, and they do massively increase the possibilities for any government that does have an ambitious industrial strategy, or maybe even has a free market strategy. The point is that it's a force multiplier, or it's a massive constrictor, right?
There was the other point that I thought was interesting in your report, which was about how actually a lot of heavy industry was opposed to regional energy prices, because that's been held up by a lot of kind of wonkish people as a very exciting update in the sector, in a way that we could encourage the development of this like transmission infrastructure that has been so opposed. Why is it only the data center producers that actually really want this, or the tech companies, and why does like chemical industries not want this?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Yeah, like so zonal pricing primarily seems to be supported by sort of what you I guess call like systems thinkers, right? Like NESO, like I think sort of the British Energy Catapult, it's essentially people that are kind of thinking, about sort of a British grid in 2050, where there's a huge amount of sort of battery storage, a huge amount of offshore wind, a huge amount of sort of like intermittent sort of renewables. And then it's being opposed, obviously, by the renewable generators themselves because it doesn't fit their economic model. It's being opposed by a great number of utilities. And it's also being opposed by a lot of the major electricity consumers and customers, like steel, like chemicals and so forth. I think a lot of these industrial users are mainly opposing it on the basis of uncertainty, right? And that basically this increases, uncertainty, reduces investor confidence, which at least in the 5 years that it would have to take for it to be implemented would increase electricity costs, right? I'm fairly agnostic as to whether this is, a viable way to go. I think the problem is that the chances of it being implemented quickly when our problems are already really acute are just very low. And when all the major actors that have skin in the game, the generators, the utilities, and the heavy industrial users of electricity seem firmly opposed to it, that's not a particularly good sign that it's going to deliver, cost efficiencies in the next 5 to 10 years, right? At least. I'm not an expert on zonal pricing. I think it, might have been a sensible thing to do if we were building the grid from scratch. But I think it's ultimately secondary to our biggest issue, which is that on a derated basis, we just don't have enough capacity, right? Like we're finding it increasingly hard to fund new gas plants, right? Because of the nature of intermittent generation, the capacity factor for new gas plants is expected to be much lower than it was previously. And for a whole host of reasons, which, I'll leave to sort of much more enlightened minds, we can't really seem to build nuclear at anything approaching like a reasonable speed, right? There's plenty of reasons for this. There's loads of countries that have built nuclear relatively cheaply in a fairly short time frame, but this just does not apply to Britain at all, right? The unfortunate thing is that the more you look into the details of Hinkley or even the new sort of Sizewell C decision, and investment, pretty much everything that happens there becomes a massive advert against nuclear power, right? And I say that as someone who's a bit of a nuclear bro. Pretty much every British nuclear development that's currently being done is a massive sort of light bulb for people to say how terrible nuclear is and how we should.
It does. It
just
does
not.
take a certain masochism to continue being a British nuclear bro, doesn't it?
Well, you just need to go abroad. You just need to travel a lot. Yeah. I mean, we know the technology, works. It's, once these plants get built, they can last for a very long time, and they're very functional. And there's plenty of reasons why it could work. But yes, I think you're not wrong. The current situation is not good. And so, you're kind of left thinking, well, beyond what we're currently doing, what else do you do? Do you accept just, more imports from French nuclear? Do you create sort of subsidy schemes where you try to bring more gas plants on board? Do you try to reopen some coal-fired power stations, right? In order to get these data centers or these new factories built? None of this is politically appealing.
I think we're going to wrap up fairly soon. I just want to ask one question before Tom takes us out, which is that there was a bit in the report as well that said about how British nuclear, it's not just that we have higher costs, but it's also that we have an energy availability of 68% versus 93% for the US. Does that mean that not just they cost more, but they're also run worse, so they're producing power for less time?
Well, this is So there's a good resource here, I think, by the International Atomic Energy Authority, which sort of shows the performance of various nuclear fleets across different countries. And yes, Britain's is not particularly good. And that sort of stretches right back to the creation of the nuclear fleet. France's is somewhat better. The US is the best performing. The US can operate nuclear plants very effectively, can't really build them very, very effectively at this stage. And then you sort of have the South Korean, Chinese, and Japanese fleets. Well, maybe not the Japanese, South Korean and Chinese fleets operating at a pretty high level as well. So yes, as with ever, there's sort of questions of institutional competence that is also sort of been a major problem for Britain's nuclear industry too.
And we've alluded over the course of this conversation to economic orthodoxy about things like foreign direct investment, of which we've had quite a lot, and immigration, of which we've obviously had an incredible amount. Green industry too. Ryan, I want to know what your and this is the realms of fantasy, because only China gets the kind of luxury of doing this. But if you were to impose a 50-year plan on British industry, what would it be? How would it compare to that orthodoxy that we're used to?
Ooh, that's a very. I think, and this is fantasy, right? So I'm allowed to sort of
This is total fantasy. Your handsome moustache faces on posters across the country. Your power is unassailable.
I don't think it's unreasonable to at least
to imagine you as a Greens leader.
Yeah, I at least try for import substitution, right? So that we can get to sort of 100% plus efficiency, or 100% self-sufficiency for some of the basic heavy industries that I outline in the report, right? Like I think cement, right, steel, aluminium, these kinds of things. I think these are things where there's no real reason why they have to be imported, right? We have the technical capacity to do this in-house, right? Around the margins, we can sort of import more, but fundamentally, we should be sort of increasing self-sufficiency in these sectors. What else would I want? I did do a piece in Dr. Sin about forge presses.
Yeah, these are really fun.
Yes. And so I think, maybe as a national mission, we should sort of say, well, there's these forge presses in China which have sort of a pressing power of about 80,000 tons. Let's sort of build sort of a national mission around creating a forge press with, 200,000 tons of pressing pressure.
And other than just making things very flat, why are these actually necessary? Given that I clearly haven't read the exciting article that Tom has.
Well, because it will reduce the porosity of metals, and the point is that there has been interest in this in the United States in the past to create even larger forge presses. Yeah, let's just create random sort of crazy technology that might be sort of one-offs, but might lead to further innovations. Yeah,
I suppose it's in the sense of like you know a lot of this work comes out of unexplored like research, right? You've got to get the extreme thing to find out how metals behave when you really squash them.
Yeah, but you need the I think the dynamism within the wider industrial base to make that possible, right? I think if there's one thing I sort of you mentioned how I say it's like Britain has really, if you take energy aside, and in fact even with energy, we really have, I think, tried our best to sort of follow best practice for the last 30 years, right? It was very interesting. I think there's this sort of liberal economist in the US, Noah Smith, who over, I think, 3 or 4 weeks ago, went on a bit of a tear on Twitter about how kind of awful Britain is, and how over it is for us, and how we suck, and how we're completely sort of backwater. And it's like, well, yes, yeah. But also, it's like, well, this isn't exactly untrue, but like we were following best practices that were coming out of American universities, right? Like, we believed in green energy, we believed in very liberal immigration policy, we believed in foreign direct investment, and we didn't care about national ownership or anything like that. And now you're saying that it's not going too well for us. Like we basically have become. I mean, Angus Hanton's book has its limitations, but I think he's right that we are kind of functionally a US vassal state now. And the Americans seem to think we suck. Like it's sort of like it's like we've become more indexed to the United States than almost anyone else, and the Americans just talk about how rubbish we are. Like it's like it's
well, yeah. I mean, we were the chumps because we didn't realize that these policies coming out were actually like mimetic weapons designed to actually make us like less functional. We're the idiots for just listening.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm to be fantastical, I think at least taking some lessons from China makes sense. Some of the Chinese industrialists like Wang Shufe of BYD or the CEO of Xiaomi, they're very interesting in that they've talked quite explicitly about how like profit margins of above 5% are an economic inefficiency, which is so far out from sort of the way we think about efficiency. But basically, their view is that if you want to build and gain market share, having too high a sort of profit margin is kind of a malady that needs to be corrected in favor of growth. And I think if we had a bit more of that in the British entrepreneur, I think that would probably serve us quite well as well. I think, having at least a slightly higher tolerance for slightly lower margins, I think that's one of the key things that Britain does need to have if it's actually going to see its manufacturing grow. And this isn't necessarily about remanufacturing, right? This isn't about going back to the 50s or 70s, right? Like this would be about somewhat rebalancing the economy so that rather than having sort of 9% of the workforce in manufacturing or 9% of GDP coming from manufacturing, it's something closer to 12% or 14% or 15%, right? And that would be a healthier position, and it would be more in line with where European countries are. It'd be more in line with where East Asian countries are. Like this would be sensible.
How important do you think industrial robotics are going to be to this kind of 50-year period? Aren't they going to overwhelm the sector?
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of like automation, and we were the original masters at automation in sort of the 18th and 19th century. Like, Britain's relative lack of automation is a massive problem, right? And it's been sort of unique, right? Like in Europe and so forth, right? Like our robot adoption is below the world average, right? The interesting thing is that this hasn't stopped us having a very high margin manufacturing sector, right? Britain's manufacturing, generally speaking, is more high value added than other countries. What it's really prevented us from is expanding at scale and actually entering new markets and being able to take significant market share, right? Because the key benefit of robotics is that it means that you can compete in mid to less high value added sectors, while retaining sort of decent profit margins. And I think that's and you can also grow at scale, right? And I think that's and you can also, grow with a constrained workforce. And so, there's obviously lots of talk about humanoid robots just sort of taking over the factories and lights out factories.
I would say that
this may happen.
So this concept of dark factories, for listeners who don't know about them, is that in China all the factories are so well automated they can turn the lights out and everything still goes. So what I would say is that in Britain we're at least halfway there.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would say, I would take those lights out factory memes with a pinch of salt, right? BYD, is a case in point where it sort of had the, focus on lights out factories and it's 97% automated, this or that. I mean, the company, and it's now China's largest automaker. It's the largest maker of electric vehicles in the world. It's the second largest battery maker in the world. From 2022 to 2025, its workforce has grown from about 300,000 people to nearly 1 million, right? So,
lots of people to turn the lights off.
Yeah, exactly, right? Lots of people pressing buttons, right? So the point is,
that is roughly the number of people we imported in 2023, wasn't it? So who knows? Maybe there is hope for our manufacturing sector.
Well, here's hoping. But the point is that if a company does lots of automation, generally speaking, the jobs are not lost in that company. They're lost by the companies they're competing with, and that's something that Britain did not understand sort of around 2000 to 2020 basically. And that's why I think that's a big reason as well. The lack of automation, the lack of technology adoption is another big reason for why our manufacturing sector is in the state it's in.
And Ryan, we'll let you head back to work in a minute. But what are you doing with your one wild and precious life to ensure that British manufacturing is revived?
Oh, blimey! What am I doing? I suppose I am a scribbler, right? Who is sort of maybe focusing somewhat autistically on sectors of the economy which sort of on the face of it, don't represent sort of a huge section of British economic life, but am nevertheless sort of promoting them as best I can, right? I think there is a dearth of people that are sort of fetishistic about British manufacturing, right? There's lots of politicians who say how sort of, manufacturing is great and, we need these good jobs, but very few people, I think, who sort of want to sort of talk about it incessantly. And so I suppose I will talk about it incessantly.
Everyone wants to wear the hard hat, but their hard hats are clean and their boots are still fresh out of the box.
The hard hat and the high-vis jacket, and then a day out from Westminster, and then go back to business as usual. Yes.
Well, not like this chap. Where can people read your work? Does it remain Dr. Sin, the Substack?
It very much does remain Dr. Sin, SYN, and I'm sort of trying to write more on it, and you can also find me on Twitter as well, and you can read the report that we are referencing in this discussion on the Jobs Foundation, and you don't even need a VPN to access it, so it's
Ryan's come all the way to low Earth orbit to use our internet.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you, listeners, for listening in. Follow us on Substack, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you, Ryan. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.